Welcome everyone to the inaugural seminar series at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. So this all came together in the summer. Dana and I organized this series, and I wanted to just give you, if you haven't been here for any of the other ones, I'll just let you know the word MIIJIM, or the title of the series, MIIJIM, Food as Relations, was conceived and as a kind of title and overarching theme for the series because of what a language speaker from Gymnasing, Jeff Menig, explained to me about the word MIIJIM and its meaning. Just one second, I want to turn off my email so I don't get those dings. So it's a meaning that relates to reciprocity and offering. So that's an important part. So thinking of the relations related to food, that food is not just isolated, is part of a kind of web of interrelations. So this series has been about land relations, and will be about, because we continue in the fall, land relations, plants, food, medicines, pollinators, growers, seed keepers, makers, artists, cooks, human and other than human relationships, art, ecology, and activism, and acknowledging systems of broad systems of knowledge. So this session is the fourth of 4 conversations that we've hosted this fall. And we will also have about 4 more in the winter semester with more of a focus on art, but also with food and gardens and all of those possibilities. So to keep in touch with us, maybe follow us on Finding Flowers on Instagram, or you can, I don't know, we'll just try to keep you posted on that schedule when it comes up. And so just to proceed here, I wanted to start, I want to acknowledge all the land and water defenders, from the water walkers to those questioning and standing up to question and to interrupt the process of pipeline development, for us to think twice and think 30 times and maybe think a lot about how land is being used and taken care of. So this work is what I want to share in thinking through, just a mention of this to be thankful for, as a way that I speak up and acknowledge lands today. So miigwech. I also want to thank my colleague, Dana Prieto, who opened up things a little earlier there. Dana, do you want to say hi again in case somebody didn't see? Say hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Dana, for all your work.
Thank you.
And keeping this happening and together. So I really appreciate it. I want to also thank Sheila Kola, my colleague in EUC, for her contribution and also her encouragement for creating the speaker series. I also want to acknowledge support from the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, the New Frontiers grant, and the York Sustainability Innovation Fund for providing funds for us to make this possible, to bring so many people together for the series of conversations. So I also want to say miigwech to all the speakers who have agreed to join us in this series, and especially the ones for today. So today's conversation, MIIJIM, migrant workers and food justice, as you can see, or maybe I should move this way, I don't know. This is it. This conversation is grounded in artistic practices, activism, and advocacy that raise important questions and considerations of labor and living conditions of those workers who grow the food that fills the grocery stores here in our neighborhoods, in our, and you know, when I think about that in this context right now during COVID and when first lockdown in March, I really wondered about those supply chains and whether we would have access to our grocery stores and food in that way. So I see this conversation relating so much to what this broader project, Finding Flowers, that I'm part of here, is doing. And also as we think through all the relationships related to like pollination and plants, I think issues of labor are so key to that material reality of food cultivation. So here I want to share a little bit of a part of a story, or just even share with you an understanding that I had about my own family on my mom's side, who moved south from the Shawanaga area in like the 40s and 50s to work on farms to pick fruit in Clarkson and Oakville area. So that was so I'm thinking about those When I think about the conversation today, I also think about the labor and of First Nations people who moved from their homes to work on farms as harvesters from about, early as 1917 and through the 50s, through the 60s, and even later into the 80s and 90s. And they faced, these bad, living conditions on these farms. And although my family was part of that labor in Clarkson and Oakville and here in Ontario, this kind of movement of wage labor was not isolated to farms of just, Southern Ontario or, Southern Ontario, North Shore of Lake Ontario region. Pockets of the country and south of the border also, also south of the border, where climate affords, cultivation of berries, fruit trees, vegetables are also part of this labor history. And Sequemic, food activist and co-founder of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, Don Morrison, also one of the recent guests on this MIIJIM series, explains that commercial food production takes place on areas that were once important traditional harvesting sites. So Morrison's statement points to not only the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from land and water across the country, but also the appropriation of these spaces for commercial food production, which in turn then employed the labor of those dispossessed. And this is where I want to consider how MIIJIM food as relations need, these conversations that we're having and thinking about the relations of the web of relations that are around the food that we make needs to engage in conversations with current issues of migrant labor justice, because we cannot look at the labor history and, we can't look at these labor histories in isolation. So First Nation workers' histories in agricultural production also calls for examining migrant labor within the current industrial food system. And there is a relationship between them. I would say there's a parallel in terms of the kinds of conditions that they were faced. There's huge differences as well. So I'm not at all saying that their experiences were the same. There's huge discrepancies there, which I won't go into because I'm not going to read you my whole essay. But the temporary foreign worker program was introduced in 1966 in response to this sort of perceived labor shortage in Canada, and farmers lobbied for this, allowing farmers to hire workers from abroad. And not long after the program's inception, research and firsthand reports revealed that despite the integral role of these workers for the economy, they arrived facing poor working and living conditions and precarious access to healthcare. And one of the people that are here today, Evelyn, I met, was able to meet through a panel that I hosted a couple of years ago. It was actually in Clarkson with Dolene Manning, Gabriel Aladwa, and Evelyn and myself talking about current issues of migrant worker rights and justice, working conditions, things like this. And also Dolene and I being descendants of Anishinaabe labor histories, broadly. So our conversation was that start of thinking about what are the connections, what are the non-connections, and also the implications of our stories and how they overlap or differ, and in this context of food production. So that was so this conversation is kind of really important to me, and so here with all that said, we've invited activist and advocate Evelyn Encalada. Did I say that right, Evelyn? I'm so sorry. Encalada. Okay, I'm pronouncing the C. Okay, Encalada, and workers' rights organizer and community artist Tzazna Miranda, to consider their calls to action through art and activism. So Evelyn and Tzazna will each do a presentation on their work, and then we'll go into conversation around their work and making visible how their work makes visible migrant worker justice. Then we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience after our conversation. So I want to, so I'm going to read the bios, and then we're going to go into, and we're going to start with the presentation. So Tzazna Miranda Leal is a labor rights organizer and visual artist originally from Mexico and based in Toronto. Hailing from Morelos, a source of power for the Mexican Revolution, art and social movements set the context for Tzazna's life and work. For the past 14 years, Tzazna has organized for change in the rights of migrant, undocumented, and precarious workers in Canada. They have also supported tenant struggles in the downtown Toronto neighborhood of Parkdale, where they led their own neighbors in a fight against unjust rent increases and evictions. As a visual artist, they have used illustration to document some pivotal moments in the decade and a half of farm worker organization they participated in. Tzazna just graduated from a master's at the York Faculty of Environmental Studies, now known as the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, where they continue the work of creating an illustrated history of migrant farm workers organizing in Canada. Currently, they are leading a group of trans and queer BIPOC artists to create ceramic sculptural work about their experiences living with chronic pain, illness, and disability. They also work as Tzazna also works as a union organizer in Toronto and across Ontario. Okay, thanks for being here, Tzazna. Evelyn Encalada is, Dr. Encalada Grez is a transnational labor scholar and community labor organizer. She is the co-founder of the award-winning collective Justice for Migrant Workers, J4MW, Justice for Migrant Workers, that advocate for the rights of migrant workers in Canada for 2 decades. Her research bridges grassroots activism with academic scholarship, and through this approach, Dr. Encalada Grez has extensively documented the lives of Mexican migrant farm worker women who work and forge transnational livelihoods between rural Canada and rural Mexico. As a public sociologist, Dr. Encalada Grez has mobilized her research through various media, such as documentaries, and given talks in venues such as Parliament Hill, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and at the United Nations in New York. She has also worked transnationally with export processing workers in Mexico and Central America, and as lead traveling faculty teaching U.S. university students in over 6 countries. For 3 semesters, she has also been the academic director of an intensive social justice study abroad program in her city of birth, Valparaiso in Chile. Dr. Encalada Grez is driven by her immigrant working class experiences and committed to decolonizing and transformative pedagogies. So we're going to start with Evelyn's presentation. If you want to take over the screen, Evelyn, that would be great. Welcome. I'll just say that if everyone could mute their mics, that would be really considerate. Thank you.
Okay, so for some reason, my heart is pumping very forcefully. I think I'm both passionate and nervous and excited to be here with all of you. And I want to start with, going into my heart and speaking to you from there. Because sometimes when we get our minds too much in the way, we get in our own way. And I want to be true to what I have seen, what I have witnessed through the lives of migrant workers and their families back in their rural communities in both Mexico and Guatemala. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm in Coast Salish unceded territories here on the west coast of this place that is recently called Canada, Burnaby, British Columbia. Thank you all for being here with us today. Without further ado, I want to step into my sort of storytelling, but before I tell some of the stories through images, I wanted to give some context to what programs exactly that I'm talking about. In my doctoral work, I formulated this framework of transnational stories, transnational storytellings. They're basically the stories of migrant workers, but those stories were given form through immigration and labor policies that construct a group of people as disposable. And a group of people that are basically used by the Canadian state and agricultural businesses agricultural profit as commodities. They're not seen as human beings. They're seen as cogs within this machine. There are two programs, and as Elisa mentioned, the first one is a seasonal agricultural workers program. This program is considered one of the flagship programs, guest worker programs in Canada. It's supposed to be a best model practice of controlled migration. And, you know, we've always said throughout the years, if the rest of the world wants to emulate Canada's way, well, it's a perfect example of how to manage a labor apartheid system to keep workers bound to an employment contract that is based on freedom, that is based on this limbo within the laws where migrant workers don't have any laws or recourse to turn to, and if they do enforce the rights that they supposedly have on paper, they are actually deported and disposed of easily by their employers. So then in the early 2000s, another program came to the fore, was created by the government. Again, like none of these programs are natural, outcomes of the labor market. They were constructed and designed by government to be able to count on a group of people without having to really be responsible for them politically or economically or socially. The features of these programs is that migrant workers are bound to one employer. They don't have an open work permit. They're supposed to work for one employer. So if they get fired for whatever reason, whether arbitrarily or with cause, that means that migrant workers lose their housing, they lose their health care, they lose their status in Canada and are repatriated. Or as in Mexico, I was told, stop using those polite Canadian words, say what it is, deportation. So yes, so they get deported, meaning that they get sent back to their home countries without wanting to return, because the reason why they were here was to provide for their families. And we have to also understand who migrant workers are. The Canadian government didn't design these programs to recruit university graduates from European countries. No, these programs were designed to basically take advantage of people from the global south who are already in a disadvantage in the global economy, whose local rural economies were already devastated by free trade policies, structural adjustment policies, everything having to do with this neoliberal restructuring of life and the planet, the globe, that countries in the global south have been suffering from since the mid-1970s. And actually, since I was born there, I have to say that Chile was the first country in the world to be a laboratory type of experiment for neoliberalism, and then neoliberalism spread like wildfire all over the world in various degrees. And of course, filtered into and were promoted by international financial institutions that then started to discipline countries of the global south. And that resulted in many people in the global south, starting from within North America, the Caribbean, seeking to leave in order to be able to survive. And so within this context, already the migrant workers who are recruited are at a power disadvantage. And so when they are here, they have to acquiesce to all demands placed upon them by their employers, because again, their livelihoods, their wages in Canada support them, their families, and their communities as well. Employers within these programs have the power to fire and deport, like I said. So employers in many ways become the immigration officials, the de facto immigration officials, but the very real immigration officials that have so much power over migrant workers' lives. And of course, the employers are the boss that also determine how workers have to work, how much they have to produce, with many workers, feeling a lot of pressure to constantly show that they are productive, many times going against their own health, showing and trying to prove their productivity so that way they could be called back to work in that same farm, be called back to work in Canada. And then employers become the landlords because migrant workers live, most migrant workers in the private property of employers. And so there's no division between basically work and after work time, when you are just returning back to the property of employers. Your bunkhouse is in the same greenhouse where you're working every single day. And then landlords could go in and out of your housing at any moment because it's their private property. And as activists, many times we're barred, and we have to be very careful when we go see some migrant workers. And sometimes I say I'm their cousin, and employers don't know, they just take my word for it, or I pretend that I'm the local Latina selling CDs, so that way I don't get anybody in trouble. But if you have watched Migrant Dreams, for instance, that was directed by Min Suk Lee, you'll see, how I also talk in that film about being strategic of where to meet migrant workers, as if we were engaging in some type of crime. But that's the context of fear and control and retaliation that migrant workers have to contend with, and that we have to be very vigilant of when we do our outreach. Lastly, with these programs, an employer can socially engineer their workforce around race, gender, and of course, class is already embedded. And this is completely inconceivable. Of course, there's discrimination and labor market segmentation in different sectors of the economy, but with this program, employers can bypass all of the basic human rights legislation that we have, and divide and conquer, cut and paste, basically their workforce according to race, gender, and nationality, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then the other context is money, profit. So 68.4 of the jobs that migrant workers, or temporary foreign workers as they are labeled within government text and policy, work in large farms that are not family farms whatsoever, that make more than $2 million or more. So then that, goes to show how also this narrative of the family farm is used as a way to discipline consumers, and they pull on our emotional strings, of protecting the family farm, but without, really acknowledging that, the family farms that many times have these labels are huge industrial conglomerates that make millions of dollars. And why do they make that money? Out of the cheap and bound labor afforded by migrant workers that are all, of course, constructed by the Canadian state. Okay, so I'm going to step into images now. When we step into the rural, we see all these landscapes, and we have to remember that landscapes are not neutral. They were conquered too. They were taken, they were stolen, these lands were stolen. And so we have all of these ideas of the rural without, necessarily asking questions about how that land got that way, who tamed the land, who has always been here. And so the rural is where, those Canadians who can afford it have cottages, and the rural evokes all of these sentiments of nostalgia and innocence, but these spaces are not innocent whatsoever. This is the Niagara on the Lake region, so picturesque and so beautiful. And then this is the Okanagan that I just took recently on my trip there to see a migrant worker that I had to be very careful of, where I was going to see him. And of course now ensuring that everybody's safe, with masks and all of that. But mostly I was worried about reprisals of him seeing, somebody, a troublemaker like myself. And then I don't know if Dana's trying to signal to me that I'm running out of time.
No, Evelyn, could you do full screen? Because these images are so great. I would love to see them much more full in the.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, no problem. We just didn't want to interrupt your flow. So there you go.
It's hard to be on the flow and then, go through the technicalities. Okay, back to my flow.
Yeah, they look great.
This is another image that I took many years ago in Leamington that goes to show like the disregard, of workers working so hard in these greenhouses. So the last thing you're gonna find there is a Mexican worker taking a nap, beside a cactus. And it's just, a way of infantilizing, making a caricature of the people who you depend on for your profits, for your $1 million profits. So it's, obviously a very disrespectful image. Then this is a shower stall, and the debris that you see there is actually sewage coming back out of the, pipes. And so this is the house, well, not even a house, a housing unit. We can't even call the migrant worker housing homes, right? This is a sewage backup in a housing unit that had all of these Caribbean workers living in. So imagine after a hard day's work, you want to shower, but you have sewage. And we have to ask ourselves, would Canadian workers be expected to live in such conditions? And then this sign is in Spanish, but it also appeared in English in the housing units of Jamaican workers in this particular farm. It basically just says that a security company is making the rounds to ensure that curfews are being respected, and that any violation of these curfews, the curfew of not having visitors after 9 p.m. during the week and 11 p.m. on the weekends, that they would be reported. So imagine having a job where after you're done your job, you basically go home, you're done, it's your off hours, but then you're still being policed, you're still being patrolled by your employer. And in this farm, some of the women told me that there was this one weekend where some of their supervisors ended up going to their housing unit to ensure that they were all sleeping there. So, so that is just frightening, the level of control. And this image, I wrote about it in my dissertation, and I have a journal article where I also unpack it some more, but it's a sign that appears outside of a portable. The portable is a housing unit for migrant workers. And, many of us, when we went to grade school, we studied in portables, and they're not, adequate for living at all, or they don't have bathrooms. And so this one was a portable where all of these Mexican women were living, expected to live well. And of course, it was very uncomfortable that they were crammed in bunk beds. But this farm also had hired Jamaican workers. And so the sign was basically for Jamaican workers to read and to completely stay away from Mexican women, because, that's another way that employers also control the labor force. They don't want men and women, of course, very heterosexist, right? Men and women to engage in any intimate sexual relationships. So it's even to that level of control on the body. And in my work, I talk about too how, in this context of coercion and control, that the act of loving, the act of, being sexual as in human, is an act of resistance. And so there was also, that glow that you see there is the sensor light. So when, any bodies would walk through there in the middle of the night, that sign would be visible. And I worked at a hardware store, and I saw a whole bunch of signs. Never in my life had I seen a sign like this. So obviously the employer went out of his way to have this sign made. Then I have more images of, the housing conditions. These were recently sent to Justice for Migrant Workers, with workers complaining about housing and how, of course, the cramped conditions was worsening outbreaks and the possibility of outbreaks of COVID-19. And again, would Canadian workers be expected? Many times, employers will say that whatever housing that they provide is much better than they have in Jamaica, Mexico, Guatemala. But is that true? That's not true at all. Then I wanted to step into, that type of segregation that I've seen over the years. There was this particular farm that I used to go to all the time in Leamington. And the first few visits, and one of my first few visits, I asked if I could use the restrooms. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I went to the restrooms. Every washroom stall had these signs. They either said Jamaicans or Mexicans. I have never seen that type of segregation in Canada. And I thought, where am I? In the Jim Crow South of the United States, type of period. And, so then there you have more of a visual where like a whole area was just for the Jamaican women, and then the other area was for the Mexican women. And of course, as a community organizer, a Mestiza Latinx, I went to the Jamaican side, but I was just so shocked and astonished to see that level, that degree of segregation. And then we have to understand this, this division, this segregation in the context of the ongoing competition that that employers engage in to extract more production from their labor force. Oftentimes, the employers will tell, let's say Jamaican workers, you know what, the Mexican workers are working harder than you, so maybe next year I will just hire Mexican workers. So obviously, these divisions are going to have the implication of separating the workforce even more so beyond the hours of work. And then when I got out of the of this space, I realized, wow, I didn't open my eyes to the degree of segregation that existed throughout the whole entire housing unit, where even the Jamaican women were separated when they had their lunch and had their meals. And food usually brings people together, but they were even separated, in their eating area. And then, I just moved to Coast Salish and getting to know lands, peoples, and nations, because it's very important to acknowledge and know where we are, right? And be respectful and fight for decolonization that, is meaningful. And one of my first few visits was to this canneries, excuse my Spanglish or my ESL. I went to Richmond, where there was all of these buildings still up from the 1900s. And one of them was the Chinese bunkhouse. And then there was also a First Nations bunkhouse as well, and one for Japanese workers. And it's almost like I had a visceral experience. All of the images and the places that I've been, that I've seen in the last 20 years in Alberta and here in British Columbia too, and other parts, and all of Ontario, all came back to me. And I'm like, where have I seen this before? I've seen it everywhere in the last 20 years, this segregation around race, around labor, around housing. And this is one image of, of how this historical society has tried to also stay true, or give make this part of Canadian history visible. And then I wanted to end with migrant workers and where they are seen just as bodies, as hands, not with minds, not with hearts, not with all of these cultures, many indigenous cultures that have been here in these lands for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years, and they come from all sorts of traditions and medicines. They bring so much culture to us. That we are better for, those of us who have the privilege to work with migrant workers, but none of that is seen. And here's an image that I took of one watermelon worker that I'm still very close to. We still keep in touch through when I went to visit her and her family. And she also makes these beautiful textiles that that is a tradition passed down from generation to generation, and she's teaching her daughter now. And here I am with some of the Mayan women that have also worked in Leamington. Some of them haven't come back. And so that's what is also important to me. Those who haven't come back, where are they now? How are they surviving? They're still a part of our community. How can we support them transnationally if Canada, just discarded them. And then these are some images that some of the women have been sharing with me, and other male workers too have been sending me in their way, as their way to be visible, to be made visible. But interestingly, you know, when I've been asking for their images, they have been omitting their faces. And that goes to show how still being visible for migrant workers could be a very real threat of their livelihoods and of being able to count on Canada for their living wage. So here are more images. And then I just wanted to end with with COVID-19, all of the issues that we have been mobilizing around for the last 20 years have been all exacerbated by COVID-19. The pandemic, you know, has placed workers at more of a vulnerability. Over 1,300 workers, primarily in Ontario, have been infected by COVID-19. 3 Mexican workers died. There's been a lot of mental health issues among workers because if their mobility was controlled before, it has been controlled even more as Canadians started to be able to, as they started to be able to go to patio dinners and go to their cottages in rural areas. Migrant workers who live and work in these rural areas, they were, you know, forced to stay indoors most of the time. And if they were able to go into the community, they were stigmatized and seen as bodies carrying disease. But, you know, for us, you know, like we keep on going, although it's been 20 years, I'm really exhausted. But, you know, now is the time to push for structural changes more so than ever. And, but now, you know, I leave these stories to you. I hope that, you know, some seeds among you were planted to question some more, to make connections between the past and the present, to see what more can be done. And for me, you know, when it comes to awareness raising, we need to step beyond that. It's about, for me, it's more about creating dialogue and bridges among ourselves, because I could do, you know, raising awareness for 20 more years. And things will stay the same. So now we just have to break those walls among us that keep us all segregated to come up with collective solutions. That's it. Thank you. And there's Tzazna.
Thank you, Evelyn. Your talk, you know, thank you so much. That brings up so many important things around layers of segregation in the system, disposability, that we'll talk about more. Also, yeah, so much more I want to ask about. Now we're going to go on to Tzazna's presentation. And yeah, sorry, thank you again, Evelyn. So amazing. I loved hearing about your research. Tzazna, you ready?
Yes, hi. That picture was 10 years ago. I just wanted to add that. Funnily enough, it gets referenced in mine as well. So
Okay.
I need to share my screen first. Oh, or actually, no, I'll introduce myself first. Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can hear my superintendent blowing leaves downstairs in the front yard. Okay, good. I closed the window. So my name is Tzazna Miranda Leal. As Lisa said, I moved here from Mexico, and I've been involved in organizing, community organizing, land-based and peasant struggles back home since I was young, since I was a teenager. And when I moved to Canada, my way to try to connect with my community was actually through finding Justicia for Migrant Workers, the same organization that Evelyn was talking about. So I've known Evelyn probably for 10 or more years. Yeah, 14 years-ish. So I did a lot of organizing with farm workers, and then with living care workers, with undocumented workers in farms, but also here in Toronto. And at some point, after a big campaign that we had in 2016 and a big caravan that we organized and that I coordinated, I needed a break and I needed to take some time to reflect on all the things that I had seen and all the work that I had done in that time and all the stories I had heard. So I went to York to do a master's so that I could take that time and that space to fill up my cup, to read, to learn. That's where I met Lisa. And so I brought to the MES, so the Masters of Environmental Studies, which now I'm sure has a different name and a different abbreviation. It's still the
No, the
MES?
master's is the same Master's in Environmental Studies still, but just the
Got it.
faculty is different.
Got it. So in my project, I went to MES because I knew that it was a place that would let me carry out this project and also provide me with support. And so Lisa was actually my second reader for most of my work, which was amazing because Lisa has this amazing critical analysis, but also this curatorial and artistic practice that to me was one of my most helpful comments and critiques and mentoring. So I wanted to share with you some of the stories that I put into this comic. So it's a story that is meant to resemble real life stories, but specifically, if you see any similarities with a real and specific case, it is pure coincidence. So I'll try to share my screen and show you. So I think we said full screen. Can people see that? Can I get a nod? I can only see you, Lisa, but you can see it? Yeah. Okay. So I called it Lakefish. You'll see why. And so what I've done is I've added panels of each page. I haven't made available my full comic because I worked on it in collaboration with a number of migrant women. And even though I finished a comic for my master's project, I still want to have the time to, and I graduated January of this year, I want to have the time to actually go back with them without the rush of a graduation deadline and get a bit better feedback and maybe edit it a little bit. And then I want to make it public at that time. So yeah, as Evelyn actually already started talking about, migrant workers face a number of workplace violations, immigration restrictions, racism in the community. But migrant women also faced added controlling attitudes from employers, monitoring, and policing of their bodies and their sexuality. So I made this comic about the story of a group of women who faced a number of sexual harassment and assault instances at the workplace and the way that they fought back. So first you'll see, this is both of these. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, okay. So this is both me, but I meant to, so I told the story in the first person so that, you know, I acknowledge the fact that any story that you tell is being told through your specific lens, through your eyes, through your experiences. And so I actually drew myself very similarly to the picture that Evelyn showed. So this was maybe 14 years ago. And then this is me on the right. That's actually my previous haircut. And I think I had blue hair, so that's why it's a different color. But I just wanted to, in that way, show that, you know, it was my voice telling a story that happened to other folks, but that I was there for. So with all the complications that comes. So this is me sort of starting this work in 2006-ish, traveling to a town called Leamington, which is not to be confused with Leamington that Evelyn was talking about. Again, pure coincidence. So yeah, so the story is about a group of Thai, Mexican, and Filipina women who moved to Leamington. You might have to move around your little speaker image so that you can see the panels, but they came to a workplace that was a nasty one. It was very exploitative. It was very stressful. Injuries were common. And as you can see on the right panel, people were asked to hand over work permits, health cards, and SIN cards. And over the period of several months, these different groups of women came. And I actually had heard about them in town, so I wanted to meet them. Their housing conditions were crowded. People lived in bunk beds. There was often, only 2 stoves for 40 people, 2 bathrooms for 40 people. It was crammed, it was unhealthy. It continued the stress of how things were at work. And soon enough, the sexual harassment started from the boss. And you'll see here on the right that on the left, that I showed women sort of talking about that on their time off when they were making dinner after work, how they saw the employer maybe harassing or touching their coworkers, or how he asked them about other workers and whether or not they had boyfriends, whether or not they thought that they would go out with him, things like that. And so that's when women started realizing that they were all sort of facing similar attitudes and similar attacks from the employer. And on the right, you see 2 sisters from Mexico that were kind of targeted specifically and consoling each other. You'll also see that I chose not to show any sexual harassment or abuse in my comic, but rather I tried to tell that story through the characters and how they spoke to each other. We'll get more into that after, I'm sure. And what this also created was a lot of conflict in the workplace. So everybody was under this increased pressure, fear, emotional attack from the employer. And as you see on the left, I showed something that happens a lot, which is some workers thought that other workers were okay with the abuse that they were facing from the employer, or that they were using his attitudes to their advantage. And this is something that happens a lot with sexual assault and sexual harassment, is we blame women and we blame people for the violence that is inflicted upon them. And so some workers thought, so-and-so is sleeping with the boss. Oh yeah, she does it to get ahead at work. And it's complicated. You might be facing the same thing, and yet you're still sort of made to believe that there's some kind of competition, that somebody's getting something out of it. And then, everybody was fighting at work. So Justicia for Migrant Workers was contacted by friends of these workers that they had made in the community. And in a rare occurrence, some of the Justicia activists met with the boss because he thought Justicia could process new work permits for these workers for free. And they went there so that they could have an excuse to meet with the workers afterwards. And I added this because this is something that also happens a lot. The workers that came to that meeting were very skeptical of the activists that came out, and were really doubtful that they could help because of how they looked. At the same time, farm workers can't unionize in Ontario, but fish filleting workers can unionize. And so these workers realized when they were approached by their union organizer that their workplace was unionized, and so that they were unionized, but that there was an attempt to de-unionize at the time. And the union organizer that came out to talk to them explained how the boss was hoping that migrant women would vote against the union because he thought he could control what they did. And there was enough of them that numbers-wise, they could win a vote to de-unionize their workplace if all the migrant women voted no. And so that all started, but women weren't at the time comfortable enough with the union folks to tell them about the sexual harassment or assaults that were going on. At the same time, they got help applying for new work permits, and they, you know, it had come to a point, and this is only some panels, but in the full comic, you'll see that they were thinking they were going to have to go home because their work permits were going to expire. The boss was seemingly not doing anything to get them renewed. But once they were renewed, they knew that they could stay in the country for another year or two, and that they could continue to pay off the huge debt that they had incurred to come to Canada in the first place. So it was a hugely relieving moment for everybody, despite all the other things that they still had to continue to face. But at least this could mean, okay, I can still send money back home, and I can pay my debt. So after the vote, the new work permits actually came right at the right time before the union vote took place. And so workers felt safe now that they had a renewed work permit to vote the way they wanted. So they actually vote and got to keep the union. And numbers wise, that decertification or that deunionizing vote, it lost because of migrant workers and because they all voted to keep the union. And so I hope the union knows that and that they thank them for keeping that workplace organized. But things were getting too hard for Veronica, which is the name of this character, this Mexican woman who you saw earlier talking to her sister at the bunk beds. She was being assaulted by the employer. And so she actually just left in the middle of all of this. She didn't have a lot of support because also other workers thought that she was getting, ahead by allowing the abuse that she was going through. So she got help from a local legal clinic in trying to get new immigration permits, so renew her work permit. And after the vote, of course, the employer singled out a group of Thai women that they thought were responsible for organizing them to vote to keep the union. So they fired them, assured them that it had nothing to do with the vote, and there was nothing that they could do. So they lost their jobs. And so when they lost their jobs, they actually spoke to the union organizer about the sexual assault. And unfortunately, it was a group of women who told this union organizer, and white guy, he felt the best way to deal with that is to drive everyone to the police station and get them to file charges against the employer. He didn't think about how traumatizing that would be or to prepare them for that. I don't think he spoke to them about what to expect. And so people went, they felt completely disempowered. They felt like they were the criminals. They it really started a process that was really, really draining and difficult, and that didn't feel like it was bringing about justice for them. But it's the advice that they got, and they all decided to do it together. But of course, it also caused a lot of conflict. At the same time, Veronica, the woman who you saw left, she also filed a police report. So then this whole criminal proceeding started against the employer. But even, more tense than the union vote was the union's next strategy. They planned a shutdown of the plant in which police officers escorted Ministry of Labor officials to conduct an investigation. And some of the workers who by then spoke more English were asked to interpret for other workers about the things that had been going on. And so it was, again, another very re-traumatizing moment. Really stressful and very isolating. Meanwhile, because the workers had reached out to Justicia, one good thing that came out of the workers losing their job and having found jobs elsewhere is that they also lost their housing, but then they could all move in together. So they rented a house together, and that became a little bit of a Justicia headquarters for organizing for the years to come. And so workers from all over town and from many different nationalities came over to organize meetings. And they had this great fish tank on the side that you can see. And Justicia recruited a Thai organizer who instantly connected with the workers and was sort of vital to the organizing that happened. And the union proposed a human rights case against the plant at that time, the fish plant. And it was around the issues of sexual violence and discrimination, unpaid wages. And so we helped them with that. We pushed a legal clinic to apply for these visas for them so that they could stay in Canada based on the fact that they were going to participate in this case and the police, the criminal proceedings. Yeah. But that also had consequences. They had exposed a very rich white sexual abuser in the community, and this was a small town. So they had people coming up to them in the street, yelling at them that they had ruined his life. You know, some of them were his family or his friends. And they paid in many ways for having come forward with these cases. And some of them chose to stay at the plant even after the case had started. Some of the folks that weren't fired, but were part of the organizing. And they instead faced fear, and they were always waiting for that time when they were finally going to get fired or yelled at or accused of being part of the organizing. So that was hard as well. And then this is the only part where I've included both pages. So this is both pages of the comic. So because of all the organizing that Justicia was doing with these folks at that time and how the house had become this headquarters for organizing, it really created this safe space for workers to come and talk about what was going on. And they all found things that they had in common: the problems with work permits, with recruiters, with the debt that they had to get into to come to Canada. And so after, you know, a lot of meetings, a lot of political education, a lot of discussion, workers decided that they wanted to organize a really big direct action. They wanted to march on the nearest city. And so we made that happen. And here you see us planning the route and making, you know, over 3 months, we made placards by hand, very old school, in different languages. We did this in their garage. We made bandanas because nobody felt able to attend a march without covering their face. And so that's the first time that we made bandanas for that purpose. And the route to the city that they wanted to march to was 52-kilometer long walk, although we rented a bus that you can see on this side, and we used that to cross over certain segments that we were explicitly forbidden from walking in. So 400 highways, police tried to stop us by threatening us with some deep, dark, hidden regulations around 400 series highways. So anyway, we took rural roads. The women that were involved in the case, they led the whole time. They held the banners at the front. They also made food. They decided on the route and the targets. And so the organizing that they were doing around what was happening at work had these sort of huge repercussions for the migrant worker movement because of the space that they created in their house. So they flyered people in these 52 kilometers of rural roads, and people had never seen anything like it out there. Coming from migrant workers, we stopped for lunch. We heard from workers. The action made national news. And this is one of the first times that this was the first action to make national news for migrant workers. This is in 2010. This picture shows a worker holding one of the signs that she made. And it really changed the way people were able to ignore migrant worker issues forever. And since then, the discourse has really changed. And even the amount of people doing this kind of work and the amount of organizations. I can't see my chat, but I can imagine that Dana is about to tell me to shut up, but I'm almost done. So here, the criminal hearing was nerve-wracking. It finally came after a long time. It took years for it to happen. They were cross-examined. You see them over here again. Once again, very disempowering, really nerve-wracking. And the human rights case also continued. It also took years, even after that march happened. And there was issues around the case. They're very isolating. So most of the time, the women involved in the human rights case were not speaking to each other about what to do. And so they were sort of isolated in making their decisions. And so most of them settled out of the case. And then this is the kind of thing that these workers talk about now with regards to the case. Actually, I should say, most of the workers settled out, and the case settled eventually with only 2 remaining people in the case. So the 2 sisters from Mexico, and they got a really big award. And it's hard to feel like that was a victory, but it was claimed as a very victorious case and a landmark. But it did change things locally. So the kinds of things that those workers think about that is that, people are now scared of Thai women. Men are warned at work, they can't do bad things to us, we're like queens. Because employers are scared of having to pay out in another big human rights case. They think the woman in Leamington has more power now, and that she shouldn't be scared to fight, and that they learned that everyone was facing the same. They thought it was just Thai women, just Filipino women, just Mexican women, but no, it's something that all women face in those kinds of workplaces. And so even though these 2 women, the sisters, got a big settlement and they won the case, and it's seen as a landmark case, they don't speak to each other anymore. They lost a lot. They lost friends, they lost family. Yeah, so it kind of created a drift between them. And one of them, she thinks, the program is a trap. It's like a prison. What happens to us is not our fault, but we got blamed for it. My own family blamed me for it. And I just, wanted to show this sort of complexity, because we like to think that, women are brave when they bring these kinds of cases forward, and it's a victory for everybody, but the cost to everybody was huge, right? And that's because the system in which we expect them to succeed in getting justice for sexual violence is one that is draining and hard and isolating and completely sort of rigged against survivors, bringing them forward. And so it's complex. It's not easy. It's not simple. That's it. So I wanted to just share that story. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Tzazna.
I'll leave it there.
Sorry, I didn't want to. You're finished? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, your presentation raises so many. Well, I mean, I just want to say I'm thankful to hear this story of a case that led to organizing. But as you said at the end, there's such complexity. Like, it's not a completely happy ending, riding off into the sunset kind of scenario. That I think that, as a choice of a maker, of a person working with narrative, that is really kind of conscious choice, consciously staying with the problems that exist in that sector, or that kind, in that labor, in those labor kind of issues. So really great. So I'm really happy to thank you for your presentation, is what I'm trying to say. I'm gonna and there's lots of thank yous coming about from in our chat there too. Thank you. We're going to start our conversation now, and what I'm thinking about, and what I really am interested to start with here is to bring our attention to, and it came through in both your presentations, the attention to the importance of visibility and representation in both your practices. So, you know, in terms of advocacy, you know, there's a kind of, there's a level of responsibility to representing people, the workers. And also in your comic, there's like a visual representation of their experiences and in the story, right? So your advocacy and organizing work is often dedicated to visualizing migrant workers' injustice and their fights for justice. So, and both of you continue to participate in the development of visual art documentary work that deals with these issues. So I'm wondering about, how do you see your advocacy and art practice connecting to visibility? You know, we can talk about that like kind of very overtly. And how do you negotiate that visibility and the importance of making injustice visible, while also, you know, it's not all about exposing everything, because there needs to be a level of respectful and sort of caring approach to the issues that might not need to be seen or heard, you know, because of privacy or research consumption, or even, you know, like what you're talking about, the trauma, the damage that trauma creates. So let's, if you want to respond to that, just thinking about visibility and the negotiation between visibility and yeah, the negotiation of visibility. Either of you, I know that both of your work links to that. So feel free with whoever wants to respond.
Is it okay if I start? Okay. It's been a very complicated process to negotiate the importance of visibility with the coercion embedded in these programs to begin with. My main praxis is to create spaces for workers to tell their own stories. But then, you know, there are consequences to that. And it's not easy. So the documentaries that I've worked on with MIIJIM, El Contrato, Teo in Toronto, just a shorter piece for TV Ontario, and then more recently, Migrant Dreams. Migrant Dreams took about 5 years to film, you know, so you see a film, but then there's all these stories on the way to the final cut of the films. And so in those spaces, you know, migrant workers have, you know, they had a level of comfort with us, you know, so first you have to always ensure that there is trust. Trust cannot be built from one weekend visit to Leamington, the Okanagan. It's, you know, been a years, you know, very decades long process for us, you know, as organizers with Justicia. You know, I don't like talking to the media. I don't like having a camera in front of my face. And that's exactly what we're asking of migrant workers who can be deported for being in front of a camera. And so, you know, in my work with MIIJIM, I've had to, you know, be always mobilizing consent, negotiating consent. You know, do they still want to participate? You know, are any issues coming up? Is anybody annoyed that the camera's here in this housing unit? It's a very long process. And sometimes, you know, well, now with the pandemic, you know, when the pandemic started in March, there was more media attention paid to migrant workers. And then at a certain point, we were competing with the WE scandal. But, you know, also, you know, we had a lot of reporters, journalists turning to us asking, you know, we can write the story, but we need, you know, migrant workers, 5 migrant workers lined up to talk to us, without them understanding, first of all, migrant workers are working. You know, we can't tell them, you know what, can you take an extended break and join us on a Zoom call? So they have no context of that, because they, you know, they have this deadline. They're talking to us from somewhere in their offices, their home office in Toronto or whatever city. When they're so disconnected from the realities of migrant workers, we can't just produce subjects at whim like that, so that way they can write up their stories. And so for journalists, they have to already have, you know, also connections to community organizers that can act as bridges to migrant workers. And they don't understand if workers, you know, come, like if they're open, if they use their own names and faces, they could be deported. For instance, in our social media, we're followed by a lot of employers and we get trolled a lot. And employers, even during that time when the historic march that we have that, fueled me for the next 10 years to do this work, it was so inspiring because it was led by the Thai women, Indonesian women, and other, amazing migrant women that were at the forefront of, of the march. And many times throughout our 12-hour journey, a lot of employers wanted to know, were my workers there? They were going through pictures, this is what we heard, through migrant workers that participated. And so that's why we came up with, mostly Tzazna and Chris Ramsrud came up with the idea of, of creating bandanas. And then recently, Loblaws, for instance, took out all of these ads and had like these humongous images of the Canadian family farms that were feeding Canada during the pandemic and posted all over, their stores. Well, they were all, of course, white Canadian family farms. And again, we've seen that erasure and that whitewashing of food production in Canada that's been so long-standing for this industry. And so we all got really aggravated. And so I started asking migrant workers that I'm still connected to please send me their images. So that way we could do ad busting. And some workers, and I told them the context and I told them that they would be made public. But some workers sent me pictures of fields just, without any bodies, without anyone. Field, like abandoned fields or rows of tomatoes without any workers, because some were concerned about being seen. So it's really hard to negotiate, needing to be seen. And needing to be seen and the reprisals of being seen, but that sometimes being seen doesn't always produce, the results that we want. It doesn't always produce status, that it doesn't get us to status, which is what we've been demanding since we first started going to Leamington 20 years ago. So then, I see that like our social justice movements have to be multi-pronged, and visibility making is of course just one of the pieces, because also, it's about a hierarchies of peoples that are in struggle, where migrant workers, their lives are just completely being devalued constantly. And during the pandemic too, the farmers or the growers were setting off the alarms that we were gonna basically starve without migrant workers. And so it's like like the consumers of food are pinned against migrant workers, where migrant workers, of course, are needing to eat too. They are consuming food. It's like the Canadians who need to eat versus migrant workers, and migrant workers are constantly used as subsidies for agricultural production. Tzazna?
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Tzazna.
So around visualizing visibility, I was in your office agonizing a lot about how to respectfully tell a story that specifically wasn't mine, even though I was there for it. How do I, who has the right to tell these stories? Who has the right to draw them, to share them? And so I really tried, and that's actually why I ended up drawing myself in the comic. I realized, one can pretend especially in academia, that one is being objective and dissecting a story all we want, but ultimately we always see things through our experiences and through our eyes. And that's something that I think I really reflected on with you, Lisa. So I just kind of settled on trying to be like, okay, well, now I'm just going to unapologetically try to tell this story as I saw it, because that's all I can really do, and that's what I can bring to it. And for me, it was really important, for example, not to focus on the employer, the abuser, too much. And so I drew him as little as I could. And literally in my panels, he's got no skin tone. He's like a ghost, which is, you know, funny in its own sense, being a white man and a story about racialized women. But I also didn't want to show him exerting violence over women more than too much or more than necessary. I never showed him perpetrating acts of gender sexual violence either, because I actually looked at a lot of stories about gender violence, sexual violence, and that's something that I found particularly jarring, where it's like I don't need to see that in order to understand what happened. And I don't think the women that I know that go through these things and the women in this story, I don't think they need me showing what happened to them or describing it in the way that they were made to describe in a legal proceeding or in several legal proceedings. So I tried focusing the story on how people lived things, shared things, created community, resisted, how workers created this unprecedented historical space in their home by virtue of opening up a home to have these secret meetings, which is not an exaggerated term. These secret meetings and just providing food and a floor to sit on and a fish tank to watch. You know, I really do think that the way in which they had to resist that case changed the migrant workers movement forever. So for me, it was important to show that because no other narrative related to these kinds of stories shows any of that. A lot of the coverage of sort of sexual violence cases in migrant workers, they focus on the nitty-gritty horrible details, and very few of them even focus on the women or the workers, the people that survived that stuff. So, and then just lastly, I also went through a lot of graphic novels and comics. You'll know this because we made a bibliography together. I found a surprising amount of comics that drew people of color in almost mocking, like disrespectful ways, which you wouldn't think of it, but there's actually a really long history of caricaturing people of color in illustration. And so I tried to be mindful of that, which seems basic, but it's actually really important because that's the basis of what you're using to tell a story is your illustration and human figures, human characters. So
yeah, that was something that I remember you know, I appreciate you giving me acknowledging the things we did together, but and you know, it feels nice that I had some impact on what you'd made, but I would say that you really brought that, you know, to the project, that you brought that careful consideration of representation. Like, how are you going to represent through, you know, how are you going to render the workers, the different workers that you would be drawing. And so I think that that was something you looked really deeply into, and even looked beyond illustration. You looked at some sort of activist posters and artists painting. You know, you looked at sort of a broad visual culture of like representation of people of color, and so I think or maybe BIPOC more broadly. So I mean, I would say that that's something you brought. And the other thing that you're talking about sort of visuality or representation was the sort of frames in between the frames that you didn't have to put forth for us to understand what these women went through. And I think that's what's sort of in this kind of sequential narrative, like that's the strength of, you know, the sequence of frames. It's what's in between those, and that you don't have to show everything, you know. And I think that, you know, that kind of plays out in film and everything that has sort of individual frames. But I really appreciated the things that you decided to highlight, and those decisions to make visible, I think brings this kind of interesting strength to that. So, and I think you talked a lot about the sort of ethics, and both of you talked about the ethics of, and the ethics and the consideration of what you've shown. I think there's this other layer too, which is really cool, of like sort of the documentation, the documentaries and the comics and things like this of the, what's being represented or visible. But the bandanas, I was gonna say handkerchief, I don't know which one, but anyway, the bandanas is another layer, like of people physically, like having making that choice to conceal their identities, and that being their own action of like covering their faces partially, at least, to be safer. Did you? So I was just going to think about. I don't know if you wanted to say anything to that. You think
I wanted to add something before
Sure.
it escapes me. So sorry if I'm interjecting.
No, that's what we want. We want a conversation here, so go for it.
A few years ago, I had an ethical dilemma with my work, and I got this teaching in a particular special way. I got the teaching of don't tell them everything, leave some for us. We can't divulge and expose all of the resources that our marginalized communities utilize to survive and thrive, because we don't know how that could be used against them. So, as a researcher, as artists, we need to make those tough decisions, and we can't tell them everything.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I was gonna respond to Lisa. Interestingly, going from writing, let's say an essay or a paper, to drawing a comic was hard, in that in a paper you're expected to trace out every step of your rationale. And in a comic, omitting scenes or omitting moments, it feels really difficult at first, but that's, I guess, the beauty of visual media, is that you learn so much from images. You don't have to spell everything out. And so I actually probably went from 150 panels to 90, because so many of them were repetitive or unnecessary. And it's just, you can express so many different things when you can see a person's face and a person's dialogue. So it's like a completely different process than writing an essay. And I've always illustrated and drawn, but I've never made a longer format work, so like a comic. So that for me was actually really hard. It took a lot of work.
Well, it was really effective too. But I like that. That's an interesting, interesting thing to think through about how we, how when we write, when we write, especially in academic context, how we write about what, how we tell the reader what you're about to see is this, and then you tell them what you're going to see, as opposed to like this, the power of like the visual, the illustration, where you don't have to tell them what they're about to see because they're seeing it. And then there's a different layer. So it's interesting to think about the different ways that you can communicate through the drawn, through illustration, I guess I would say. Do you think that there's like, sorry, I want to just think about accountability a little bit more, but can you think about, like, you did both speak to some, the whole story that you shared, Tzazna, was about a kind of advancing of recent, sort of advancements of migrant workers' rights, with not an easy one, and to, a debate, arguably it caused a lot of really difficult repercussions, but maybe if either of you could talk a little bit more of other things, or maybe talk a little more about what you've seen as far as, let's say, the advancement of workers' rights from maybe this increase of awareness of their working and living conditions. And that's a question for both of you. So if you want to just take it up, whoever would like to. For maybe Evelyn, if there's anything you kind of noticed with, maybe since Min Suk's film or the other kinds of films, if there's anything else that you could talk about, the changes, or after the long walk too.
In this line of work, we have to think about what we conceive of success, what we conceive of triumphs. There's been cases that have been won, right? But then for those cases, then there's, the structural issues that remain the same. So with Migrant Dreams, for instance, there was a story of two Jamaican workers. One of them, Carlos Burrell, he went through so much for speaking up against the working conditions in his farm. And he was recently granted humanitarian status, so we were celebrating. But then, along the way, when workers challenge the whole system, the system falls on them, and they go through a lot, and so do their families, the families left behind that they are separated from for so long, right? So we can't forget, families, children. A lot of the migrant women in my study, in the years that I've followed migrant women back and forth from Canada to Mexico, would tell me, how they would leave at night when their children are sleeping to not further traumatize their children. So wow, so many stories and strategies that workers undertake that also consider their families, and then we need to consider their families. Right now, for instance, one of the mild triumphs, I would say, is that there is an open, there's a visa for vulnerable workers that the government launched recently. It allows workers that were in vulnerable situations to leave their employment, still stay in Canada. However, with this visa, they have to prove that they were vulnerable workers, proving that, if they don't have a text message, if everything done was said orally, if the demands came through an employer representative and not necessarily the employer directly, who doesn't speak English, or who doesn't speak the particular language of migrant workers, it's hard to prove. But then this open work permit, if they do prove it, only lasts for 1 year. And then workers are left to, find housing. Like we're having a housing crisis all over Canada, much of North America, and in rural areas, housing is also, a very grave concern. There's hardly any housing available for workers. So they're left on their own to fend for themselves. They have their visa to basically support them, but it's very limited. It's only 1 year long, and then they could basically leave these programs forever and not be sent back to these programs by their recruiting countries, the labor ministries that send them to Canada. So then they could be ousted from these programs altogether if they do, decide to go that route, and they could be seen as troublemakers. But I would say that also, during a particular time too, there used to be a 4-year limit on how many on workers that were working in the NOC C&D program before. The government sent a message, the federal government under the Harper administration, we're still dealing with all of the horrible effects of the immigration policies imposed by that government, by Jason Kenney, who's now in power in Alberta, and oh my goodness. And anyway, yes. And so they instituted a 4-year rule, meaning that migrant workers under that program could only be in Canada for 4 years. After that, they had to leave Canada altogether, and then apply in 4 years more to send a message to Canadians that these were definitely temporary programs, and don't worry, migrant workers are not taking your jobs. And I remember during that march, that historic march, some workers asked me, Evelyn, do you think we could win against this 4-year rule? And of course I was going to say yes, but at that time, I had no idea that we could defeat that. Well, we defeated it, but it was also because, the migrant justice movement, we all rallied together and did lobbying and expressed our concerns of how devastating that was to migrant workers, but also employers. They exercised their weight, and then they were also in disagreement. So there was, convergence there. We agreed with employers. So I can't take the full credit as a migrant the migrant justice movement cannot take the full credit for that. But that was eliminated. But then workers still got caught in that law, and many ended up going underground, and many some workers that had to leave they left because they wanted to follow the rules, but they left in the expectations that their employers would call them back, and they were just completely forgotten. And we can't forget them. So what is it like to be able to count on Canadian wages for a certain period of time in your life, and then to go back to rural Guatemala, and then just to be discarded. And if you're a woman, your gender vulnerabilities follow you wherever you are. So what is it like to pick up your life? So that's what I'm interested in, and I'm still, supporting workers as much as possible. So there's been gains in that regard, but I see more gains in, in how workers, they return to a space in their lives where they can dream, where, they see now status is more close to them than ever before. And, all of us who are involved in the migrant justice movement, were part of, pushing to get us to this, to this mountain, where that is more of a possibility than ever before. And we're not going to stop until the government apologizes. But, Canadians are really good at making apologies. The apologies have to come with material reparations. And, one of the material reparations and one of the material compensations could start with status.
Yeah. And so this is like a really big transformative work that can't just be left to, well, I guess maybe we could think about who are the different actors or people involved in different levels of responsibility and accountability for this transformative work. So whether, I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, you've mentioned already, the organizers, we think about, I don't know. I guess I'm just wondering if you can think of the sort of the actions that different levels can take to help with this transformative work, do you think?
Tzazna?
I know it's the sort of question that I was trying to avoid, actually, but
we're all accountable.
Maybe I should reform that. not that I was trying to avoid it, but it's the question that, as opposed to saying what can we do, it's more like, well, who, what are the different levels of people that are responsible and accountable to this, to these conditions, and
I've already spoken too much, so I don't know, Tzazna.
Sure. So I feel like the more time I spent organizing, the more, to me, the path forward for us seems to be to organize our communities first.
Our own communities.
Yeah. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I reached out to my neighbors because we were hit with an above guideline rent increase, as many Torontonians and Parkdale folks will know, are a common problem, and there's no adequate way to deal with them that isn't organizing. And I think I've seen that throughout my life, that, organized communities can respond quicker and better to anything that comes up. And so that includes where our food comes from, where we can put our solidarity, if we can come out to important, decisive moments and things that are happening in our city. And so I think it doesn't matter where you start, but organizing your community, I think, is the start. And it can be your workplace, it can be your building, it can be a faith-based space, or an ethnic, language, racial-based community. But, in doing migrant worker organizing, the places where solidarity came, and it was really appreciated, but it was really well sort of organized, as places that were organized already, be it workplaces or neighborhood-based things. So I think that is where we need to start. And the way forward, I think it shows itself much more easily once you have the capacity to respond. because we feel isolated and like one person's actions won't change very much. But that's why having your building organized or doing some neighborhood organizing or some workplace organizing can make you realize the access to resources that you do have.
Okay. Yeah. And I know we wanted to also talk about, thank you so much. I know we wanted to talk about, and I think organizing is relevant to this and doing what we do in our communities or our own households, let's say, or our neighborhoods, and thinking about COVID and how it's kind of been it's a wake up call to understand how deeply connected our lives are to each other, from understanding some difficult concrete implications of breathing the same air and the bubbles that we're creating with other people, to online networks or caremongering, to acknowledging, the vital role of the frontline workers. And the word essential has a kind of different rippling meaning right now, but in sustaining our lives. But how would each of you like to say something about this, the effects of COVID on migrant workers now, what is happening? And maybe once we can maybe open it up to some of the people that are here with us on the call for some questions. But first, I know you really wanted to talk through this, and so I wanted to offer that, open that up. So how it's affected, or maybe even, are there any new forms of solidarity and collaboration that you've seen rise during these times that you would like to talk about?
Well, this season, and mind you, migrant workers talk about their lives in Canada in terms of seasons, right? And that's how life flashes by. So I'm using their language, the way that they frame their lives. So this season has been the most difficult for most migrant workers because of the pandemic. There was a time when migrant workers from Mexico were quite stigmatized during the so-called swine flu. But now many migrant workers have had to contend with further control and policing in their farms, like I said before. And migrant workers have had to constantly live in anxiety that many workers instead call nervios, this broad term that encompasses, like a state of unease and despair, and that has bodily symptoms, that doesn't allow you to sleep, that doesn't allow you to function well, because they're constantly worrying about getting COVID at work. And then they're done work, but they're still in that world of work because they go back to their cramped housing with all of their coworkers. So they can never escape, those spaces that make them highly susceptible to getting COVID. So this is how they've had to wake up every single day, and they're worried about their families. I was talking to some Mayan workers this week, and they're telling me a lot of elders in their communities are dying, and then they don't know what to do, if they are going to be able to go back to Guatemala to visit for 2 weeks, because under the NOXI&D program, workers are able to return once a year at their own expense, and they come right back. And so, workers are dealing with a lot of grief and despair, and not knowing what's going to happen in the future. They're always torn between being here, being there. They're, in many ways, being everywhere allows them to be like nowhere at the same time. So it's hard to, stay focused and take care of themselves. So this is the context. But what we've also have seen is that, communities are coming together in the Leamington area, Windsor, Essex, for instance. Justicia organizer, mostly through the work of Elizabeth Haas, she's been mobilizing all of the networks at Justicia and that she has there to provide food boxes, for workers, to make sure that they have appropriate and culturally appropriate food, because some workers who were forced into quarantine and sent to these motels in Windsor or other places in Leamington, they were just abandoned in these really cold, awful motels. Nobody was checking up on them. They were being brought food once a day. the food was left on the floor, of course in containers, but for many of our cultures, you don't leave food on the floor, no matter what, they're wrapped in. It's, a sign of huge disrespect. And then the food, wasn't appropriate. It wasn't enough food. It wasn't culturally appropriate. So, workers were complaining to us, Justicia, that they were going hungry. So these are workers that are producing the food that we consume, and they're going hungry, and they're supposedly being taken care of in these places. So then Justicia, it also contacted and started to work with Food Share and making sure that, that we use the networks that we have in order to get food to workers. So then there's been, examples like that. There's new networks that are being created. And then the labor movement unions also are helping within the Windsor-Essex region to provide personal protective equipment to workers. But, mind you, all of this has to be provided by the employers. But, when the state fails, the employers fail, then communities have to come together. And this is what we've been seeing. So I have seen, really negative effects, and I'm also seeing opportunities and new networks and support systems.
Thanks so much, Evelyn. Tzazna, did you want to add to that, or do you want to go on to a question from the one of the people that is joining us here?
Yeah, I think that covers it pretty well. I can go on.
Okay, if you want to add to it, even within the answer that we have, or the question that we have from Elizabeth Barrera. Elizabeth, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, for sure. If that's okay with you, I would love to.
Sure.
So, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Tzazna and Evelyn, for being story keepers and allowing migrant workers to share their stories within their own narrative and empowering migrant communities and migrant networks overall. Thank you so much for the talk. I just wanted to know if you happen to have any data or information on the barriers to education that workers may face when they're accompanied with their children and they wish to enroll them in schools within Ontario.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. In the programs that we've been talking about, workers are not allowed to bring their families. And so there's typically no children that are even allowed to accompany them. Not to say that that doesn't happen sometimes in some other ways. So only workers with so-called high-skilled occupations that come with high-skilled work permits. So high-skilled occupations include teaching and so-called professional jobs. So those folks could bring their families with them, but that's not usually people doing farm work or care work or those kinds of jobs. And a lot of people do come as tourists with tourist visas with families sometimes, with hopes of finding work and being able to stay and doing it not through the programs, as we call them. And so that's typically who I see bringing children with them and doing that kind of work. And even though through Ontario legislation, children of undocumented people have the right to attend public schools here, that gets complicated when they do have a visa and they're specifically under tourist visas. So it varies school to school because it depends a lot on the staff that are there. And I used to work with awesome people of Parkdale Community Legal Services, the legal clinic in Parkdale, and I saw my coworkers, for example, Ratika Lasavitasan, do a lot of work on trying to get children into school, and so did all the other staff there in the local schools. But it really varies because if they found out you're on a tourist visa, then they'll say you're not, the children of undocumented people. You have status, and so you have to pay international student fees, and so people sometimes do that instead and try to sort out their paperwork. Yeah, but typically most of the people that we were talking about and that you saw referenced in these stories wouldn't be able to come with their kids.
Thanks, Tzazna. Are there any other questions from from everyone that's here. Like I'm kind of also focused on those who from my food, land, and culture class. You must have a question. So I'd urge you to maybe don't be shy. This is your chance. But while we're waiting for questions, some more questions, because we still have a bit of time. Are there any, Tzazna, I was just going to ask Tzazna if there's any kind of solidarity or collaboration that's happening that maybe hasn't been mentioned yet. Maybe we covered it all. Or even like some sort of highlighting some, those sorts of things that are kind of encouraging and the things that you see a bit of hope within. Coming out of COVID now and coming out of, not coming out of COVID, but being in the midst of it and workers. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's good. I think Evelyn did a good job of covering a lot of the things that have been happening around COVID. I would suggest the Instagram account, especially for connecting to actions, because Justicia finally joined the Instagram platform so very late, but it's because there's new organizers getting involved who realize just how important those kinds of platforms are now. And so I think they added the link. Oh yeah, it's right there on the chat. So there's often online actions and caravans planned to bring food and things like that throughout the COVID pandemic. So you can check them there. And was there a second part to that question, Lisa? Sorry.
No, there wasn't really a second question, part of the question. I kind of just added that if there was anything that was sort of inspiring or something that you wanted to highlight that you saw a lot of encouragement from that's happening. And also Evelyn too, like something that's kind of nourishing you right now in a way, not to make you like, recount your favorite recipe or anything, but just thinking about something that is sort of nourishing you or that's, kind of giving you encouragement. Maybe that's too hard to answer. So you don't have to, we don't have to find like some kind of, sunset at the end of this or lovely, happy ending to our talk today. But I just thought maybe we could, I don't know. I'm just asking that about you, about if you have anything that's giving you a bit of.
What I do want to share is that change is a zigzag process. It's messy and we fall, we get up, we go through the 3 B's that I wrote about in my work, breakdowns, burnout, and breakthrough. It's like a cycle, but we're not alone. There's been so many people before us and so many people that are going to be, coming. Well, there's so many people that did all of this work in the past. We can't forget about them. We have to uncover their stories. And then I just think about all the stories that are still left to be told that we're carrying around. Sometimes I see a picture and then that brings me back to this moment in this place in Leamington or, in Guerrero, when I was also in an indigenous communities with migrant workers, them telling me about their lives, them growing up. Then it brings me back to those stories that have to be documented, and that that for me like just shows and completely goes against the way that migrant workers are commodified. At the same time, I always like also step into this dilemma with my work. It's almost like a lot of our praxis is about our decolonial work is showing how our communities are comprised of human beings, valuable human beings that have, value to their life. And so, so I always think about, what if I'm not speaking from that place? Will our work look more different? Why do I have to who am I writing to? Am I writing to white scholars or the white public, reminding them that our communities are marginalized? What if I stop talking to them? And what if I create a different type of dialogue, or I'm a part of a different dialogue? Will I, then tell stories in a different way? So, those are the issues that I'm grappling with. But what keeps me going is the words of the women, you know, like Alejandra saying, yo tengo que poder, I have to do it, I have to be able to do it. And, you know, when I think things are rough for me, when I didn't want to finish my dissertation because, you know, it's academic hazing, you know, especially towards the end. And then I thought, you know, I thought of their words, you know, I thought of migrant women's words, and I knew that these stories were not mine. I had to put them in paper. You know, some of the articles that, you know, that many of us in Justicia have written ended up, you know, in this landmark case as evidence to show the vulnerability. So our work, our words, our migrant worker stories can reach different spaces and take on so much power. So we need to keep going, document, but of course, always being very mindful that not to tell them everything, and just to remember that we're part of something much greater than ourselves. Put your ego aside, keep going, keep letting the stories live through you, keep letting the stories flow through you, keep letting the stories give you life. That's what keeps me going.
Beautiful.
I can talk about that, but is it okay if I address a couple of those questions that are in the chat,
Yeah,
Lisa?
that's what I was going to say. So you're right on. Great.
Great, no problem. So are there any plans for doing projects with the workers in their own countries? So we've done this to a certain extent at different times in multiple countries. Most of the people in Justicia have a connection to one of these countries. Like I grew up in Mexico. Evelyn has spent a lot of time in Mexico and is from Chile. Chris, who you might know, is Trinidadian. So we've done a bit of this over time. I think our limitation is obviously around being a volunteer collective, and you know we can only focus on so many things. But for example, one thing we did is we were working on requesting a coroner's inquest into the death of Mr. Peart, a worker who died here in Canada, and we were seeking changes to the Coroner Act so that coroner inquests be mandatory for agriculture as they are for construction and mining, which are two other very dangerous industries in Canada. And through working with his family, we actually traveled to Jamaica one time and created a bit of a relationship with the Norman Manley Law School in the University of the West Indies so that they could help us facilitate the families be able to come to their offices to send things to Canada back and forth for the case and things like that. And you know, Evelyn's done a number of things. I've been involved in things with Mexican movements as well and trying to connect those. But yeah, we limit those to some extent depending on, you know, our capacity. And I would say we put most of our energy into how things are here. But of course, everyone's carried out different things. And then another question Jessica asked. When I talked to my MP in Mi'kmaq about migrant worker issues in a phone call in June, his counter argument was that a few bad apples in terms of employer exploitation, but also a new pilot program about starting off 5,000 migrant agricultural workers with permanent residency status. Do you know about this program? And is it an attempted PR move to quell resistance? Or is there any policy emerging that does address the issues of exploitation and the lack of rights? So we've been calling for status for migrant workers for a couple of decades. I will take credit, not for myself, but for all of our work. It's a big number of people that have put work into this, and that's the reason why these piecemeal program offerings have come about. This is something that would have never been talked about 10 years ago. And so they've tried putting little things out there like this program in different places, including provincially through the provincial nominee programs. But it's also to keep employers happy, because some employers have very powerful lobbies and have realized that they want the same workers coming back every year, and so they might as well find a way to get status for them. So, and in terms of the few bad apples, that's what everybody says. That's what a lot of people think, or a lot of people think, you know, my uncle's a farmer. He hires migrant workers, but he's nice. They're like family. So it's a very common sort of concept. But it's not about a few bad apples, right? There's a reason why we moved to change the way things are done systemically. It's because we shouldn't, our livelihoods, our homes, our jobs should not be up to fate to see if we get a bad apple or not. There's a reason why instead we focused on creating protections by way of, labor law and things like that. It's because we cannot rely on employers being good apples. And that's why there's minimum, and I do mean minimum employment standards, but that's the reason we have that approach, right? It's that it needs to be a systemic thing. And in terms of things nourishing me right now, I've been less active with Justicia things lately. I really burnt myself out through the work, and what has kept me going in the last little bit is making art with my community. So I think it started with this comic, but now I'm doing some ceramics on chronic pain with people from my community. And yeah, I think I want to show people that I will probably be an organizer forever, or at least for many more years, but it's important to take the time to replenish. And yeah, I've been making painkillers in the shape of ceramic pain pills.
Oh,
So
I'm curious.
what I've been doing lately.
Oh, someone's asking if they can check out the ceramics anywhere yet.
I'll put our Instagram. We haven't put anything up because throughout COVID, we were supposed to be making work together. And so instead we created kits so everybody could make at home. But we will be posting, I'll be posting the work. I think everyone's finishing it. I'll link it.
Okay. So we're pretty well on time, 4:31 official Eastern Standard Time, depending on where you're coming from. I feel like I'm really getting this talk show host thing down a little bit more. Anyway, it's been really so lovely, amazing, inspiring, thought-provoking, all of the things that you want. Talking to both of you, Tzazna and Evelyn, and I really appreciate you taking the time, because I know that there are so many pressures right now, and everyone's asking everyone to do something like this. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing and being able to have this conversation with us. It means a lot, and you've brought a really important critical element to this series, the MIIJIM series, as well as of course, the broader effects of your work. So I just really appreciate everything you do, and I hope that we can continue talking, and I feel like we have a friendship that we can continue cultivating. And so I just, that's going to be the end of this semester's series of MIIJIM talks. But we are going to continue next semester. It will have a bit more of a focus with art and food and growing and gardens and things like this. And as a special feature, our first session, which hasn't been determined as to when that is exactly, but I will be launching the MIIJIM Food as Relations theme show song, which it will employ my new, well, not my new, but my practicing of Anishinaabemowin that I'm studying. So it will be the words will be Anishinaabemowin, and so far it's coming along. That is all, I think. And as it's always hard to say goodbye, but there's lots of thank yous happening in the chat. So please absorb those, Evelyn and Tzazna. And I really, thanks so much, MIIJIM. And thanks for everyone coming. And Food, Land, and Culture class, we're going to meet in like 10 minutes for a little discussion debrief. And I bet Sarah Rotz's class is also going to meet maybe for a little thing, but I'm maybe speaking out of turn here because.
Thank you for having us, Lisa and Dana.
Thank you so much, Tzazna and Evelyn. Thank you everybody for participating. We'll be posting this conversation in our social media and on YouTube, so you can watch it or share it if you want. Have a good night.
Gracias. Ciao.
Gracias.
MIIJIM.